What's up everyone, I'm Twisted. The second league season of 2025 has been over for a while, and so, just like I did for the first season, here's a retrospective of all the lore we got. I know this is coming out super late, but don't worry, I'll try to do a video on season 3 before this year ends. When it comes to these league seasons, new lore comes in many different forms and mediums, from cinematics on YouTube to comics inside the client, so my goal is to help some of you keep up with everything new surrounding the lore. Do keep in mind that this video won't be a substitute for actually experiencing the lore yourself, as I won't be going over every single detail. I highly recommend you watch my retrospective on the first season of 2025 before watching this video, but in case you need a small reminder, in that season we saw LeBlanc summoning Atakan, so that the demon could tell her the location of an ancient Darkin weapon. Spirit Blossom Beyond starts off in April with a brand new cinematic. Here we get our first look at Yunara, the season 2 champion. Her location as well as these flowers will become more relevant later. This cinematic also depicted some of the upcoming Spirit Blossom skins. These skins were based on the various myths from Ionia. Emphasis on the being based on, as the skins themselves aren't the myths. I have a whole other video about that topic in case you want to understand it better, but I think it's a good time to say that I won't be covering the lore of the new Spirit Blossom skins because, unfortunately, they are too detached from the actual narrative unfolding this year. As we'll see, the myths of Ionia are a major focus of this season, just not these myths in particular. In the cinematic we see Shen arriving in Ionia. At the time we still didn't know when in the timeline this took place, but now we know for sure it's happening shortly after Swain's coup and before the Major Rebellion. We see him climbing some stairs and arriving at this location, where we can see a mountain with a huge hole on it, almost if a part of it disappeared somehow. The cinematic ends with a teaser that Shen and Yunara will cross paths at some point. In the cinematic we can also spot Kennen, who will play a minor role in the narrative, and the same can be said about Shen, who can also be seen here. In May we got the Pilgrimage comic. This showed us that Shen is experiencing some identity issues, with his life starting in Ionia, being stolen by Noxus and then getting a second chance in Demacia. He's conflicted as to where he truly belongs. We see him arriving in Avori during the Spirit Blossom Festival. We know this takes place way before the Major Rebellion of Demacia, meaning this is a minor retcon to the lore established before Arcane. Before the show became canon, the first Spirit Blossom Festival to happen in Ionia since the invasion started only happened years after the Noxians left. A Spirit Blossom tree has grown in the gardens of Demacia, and this is the reason for Shen to return to his homeland. At least one of the reasons. This Spirit Blossom tree is likely tied to the seed Shen picks up in the royal gardens of Demacia in LeBlanc's story, with LeBlanc herself potentially being behind Shen returning to his homeland. In a conversation with other Ionians, he tells them about the tree and mentions how magic has been rising everywhere, which is likely tied to the events of Arcane, but we still don't know for sure. Kennen, who was listening to the conversation, interrupts Shen just as he's about to mention a change in the balance. He takes Shen for a walk and reveals that these Spirit Blossoms began blooming not even a season after the Noxians left. Again, a small retcon to what was previously established. They pass through a statue of Yunara, known by Ionians as the devoted Shrine Maiden. The comic gives us a taste of what her legend in Ionia is. According to Shen, her myth says that during the War of the False Kenmei, she followed her patron spirit into exile. When this comic came out, we already knew that LeBlanc was searching for a Darkin, so it was easy to put 2 and 2 together and understand that the War of the False Kenmei was actually the Darkin War. But this myth being presented this way was our first hint that the myth itself is far from what actually happened, something that will only be fully revealed in the 3rd season. Kennen leads Shen to a Kinku temple at Koeshin. The comic ends with Shen planting his tree in Ionian soil, saying that all things should return home, wherever that may be. In June we got a small teaser for the lore to come. Here we see multiple dark Spirit Blossom flowers blooming all of a sudden, right before Yunara's temple returns from the Spirit Realm to Ionia. With it came multiple Azakana, and we see both Yunara and Shen fighting against them. We also learned about a Wild Bloom, a massive bloom of Spirit Blossom flowers where the flowers can appear even outside of Ionia. The last one happened during the final years of the Great Darkin War, and this new one was responsible for bringing the temple back to the material realm. This is all we know about this phenomenon. This will not be explored at all anywhere, it's barely even mentioned in the lore itself. Days later we saw the release of the comic The Devoted Shrine Maiden. This comic depicts Yunara's myth in Ionia. Emphasis on the myth, as even before we got confirmation that this comic doesn't depict what actually happened, we could already assume that was the case. The comic starts with Shen and Kennen talking about the myth of the Devoted Shrine Maiden, and the whole comic takes place inside this scroll until the very last pages where we cut to the real Yunara, meaning everything else was just a story. And according to this story, there were once Kenmei spirits that guarded Ionia. In time, the spirits revealed their true faces. They saw themselves above the mortals and waged war in Ionia. As I said, these Kenmei spirits were actually the Darkin. This myth does hold some truth, but is not entirely accurate. A shrine maiden went to the temple of her village and prayed to the patron Kenmei of the shrine to help her people. At first, he refused to help, but upon realizing the nature of Ionia's enemies, he changed his mind. Together, the maiden and the spirit fought the false Kenmei, and were successful in purging all traces of them and their followers from the land. Later, the great spirit confessed that he had lied to the maiden, for he was no different from those they fought. Fearing he would not overcome his nature, he chose to leave the mortal realm. The maiden, refusing to abandon the great spirit, joined him in his exile. We then transition to the present, to the real version of Yunara, who, like the myth suggests, is in another realm, this being the spirit realm. The comic ends the moment the temple returns to Ionia. The second act of this season saw the release of a brand new era map, called Koeshin's Crossing. There's not much to say here in terms of lore, but we do learn from his voiceover that one of the shopkeepers, Lao, was once part of the Kinku Order. He was a Feast of Shadow, one of the 3 most important roles of the Order. We also learn that he once wielded the Aeon Erna, Yunara's weapon, before passing it on to someone else. We will later learn that he was once Yunara's master, but at the time this was our first teaser that Yunara was part of the Kinku. In July, we finally got a big minigame inside the client, the Battle of Koeshin. The story of the game starts sometime after Shen and Kennen met. We can see them meditating together when suddenly the temple returns from the spirit realm. Alongside it came demons, and so Kennen left to find Shen and Akali's mother. Shen stays to fight the demons, and it's here that he meets Yunara. He is surprised by seeing a member of the Kinku, and after mentioning Kennen, Yunara assumes he can be trusted. Together they fight the hordes of demons until they meet a demonic pretender, a demon taking the form of the Grove Mother, the legend that Spirit Blossom Morgana is based on. Demons feed on negative thoughts and feelings, and this one is interested in the longing that both Yunara and Shen feel. It also says that despite them fighting together, they are both alone. This is obviously referencing how both Shen and Yunara feel like outsiders in their homeland. They defeat the demon and venture into a forest nearby. There, Atakan rushes past them, but they dismiss it and keep on fighting the other spirits. Yunara mentions her master and how he passed the Iron Erna to her. Again, we know this was Master Lao. Later, they arrive at a port town for a final showdown with the pretender. With the tip of Shen's spear on his chest, the demon is defeated. Together, they return to Koeshin, and Kennen is surprised to see Yunara outside her post. As he mentions this, alarms ring out from the temple. Someone breached it, and it's not hard to figure out who it was. The comic ends with the trio leaving to deal with the intruder, and the teaser that Shen will be tested in the future. With the game, we also saw the release of Yunara herself, and with her voiceover and biography. The latter takes the form of damaged manuscript fragments recovered from the old ruins of Koeshin. They are written by Yunara and describe her past experiences before and after arriving in the spirit realm. This is divided into 6 parts. The first part is about her fighting Azakana to protect the temple. In the second, she reminisces about Lao and his teachings, how he warned his acolytes about the Darkin. In the third part, we go back to when Yunara and Lao faced one of the Darkin, one that's implied to have killed Yunara's master. The next part focuses on the Kinku, how Yunara joined them as a child, and how she later swore to guard the Temple of Twilight. Here we get our first mention of Master Binan, the Eye of Twilight from her time. Then we learn that Yunara mostly just trains and meditates while in the spirit realm, and that she has become much stronger. Finally, Yunara describes a memory she was having, one where she and a companion chased Pra and her followers up a mountain. But this memory then turned into a vision, as she was now inside the temple and her companion was now a stranger in foreign robes, something that didn't actually end up happening. I want to point out that when her bio was released, it was vague enough about the Darkin War in Ionia that it didn't contradict the myth comic at all. As I said, we'll later learn that the myth is far from accurate. Yet here her bio was written in such a way that we wouldn't be able to tell that just yet, which I think was very clever. In her voice lines we learn how she feels like the Kinku should be more active when it comes to protecting their homeland, a sentiment she also expressed in the Battle of Koeshin. Something she also mentioned in the game was how she feels like an outsider in her own land, and that's also present in her voice lines. We get this line which hints that the Kinku might have used shadow magic when she was alive. This line was hinting that the myth was far from accurate, and here we got another teaser at some kind of test Shen will have to pass. And so ended the second season of 2025. This season saw both Shen and Yunara returning to their homeland, both because of the Wild Bloom, this phenomenon that we still don't know anything about. Shen looking for answers related to the Spirit Blossom flowers, and Yunara being suddenly brought back to the mortal realm. This season, however, did not answer the questions left by the first one, and in fact it only left more stuff unanswered. Just like last time, I want to share my final thoughts on this season. In general, I found that the first season was more interesting, and I think part of that was due to the second season focusing so much on Spirit Blossom, the festival, the spirits, and the skins. This felt a bit forced in my opinion, as it was barely even tied to the narrative that was developing. Again, the only myth that mattered in the end was Yunara's. Morgana's was mentioned, but it was clearly more so to promote a gacha skin than anything else. And the only relevant part of the Spirit Blossom Festival was this new phenomenon called Wild Bloom, which caused the flower to bloom in Demacia, which became the reason for Shen to return to Ionia, and this was also what caused the Temple of Twilight to leave the Spirit Realm, which is easy to forget, honestly, with how little it is actually mentioned in the lore. This Wild Bloom felt more like a MacGuffin than anything else. None of the characters even addressed it in the story besides maybe Kennen here. The team of the Spirit Blossom was clearly just here to sell skins and not for the actual lore, which is very disappointing as Spirit Blossom tends to be in terms of lore in my opinion, and funny enough, the Spirit Blossom Festival was also the only retcon in this season, so yeah, we got a lore retcon just to sell skins. And again, as I said, Season 2 did not answer many of the questions left by the first season. Instead, it told its own story, which will then cross paths with the previous one on the third and final season. I think this was fine once we had the full picture, but being so hyped by the first season, only for very few of its narrative to be present in the second one, was a bit disappointing at the time. Enough with the negatives, let me also highlight some of the positives. The art of this season was gorgeous. Some of the pages from the comics are amongst the best art to come out of the IP in my opinion. Comics that are now fully voiced over, by the way, which is really great.
Your enemies are my enemies.
And speaking of comics, my biggest criticism of the previous season was that a lot of its lore was only temporarily available, with the minigames and comics being gone forever once they were removed from the client. Since then, Riot has tried to fix this, as they began uploading the comics on their official channels. Now, obviously you can't experience these like you could in the client, and the more interactive experiences like the Demon's Hand game are just impossible to replicate in a video, but it at least shows that Riot cares about this issue, and I really appreciate them at least trying to solve it. Skin Spotlights has actually managed to do what I wish Riot would, which is an archive where these experiences are permanently available. He even managed to include some older ones, which is awesome. And so this concludes my retrospective of Season 2 of 2025. Do let me know your thoughts on this season down below. I'll now be working on a retrospective of Season 3. So if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing if you haven't already. It's free and you can always change your mind later. I'm Twisted and I'll see you guys in the next video.